After lighting a cigarette, Alfred Lanning declared, "It reads minds all right." Lanning was a recurring character in Isaac Asimov's science fiction. In this particular story, the director of a plant of US robots and mechanical men was talking about Herbie, a robot with a positronic brain of supposedly ordinary vintage. Herbie had the ability to tune in on thought waves, leaving Lanning and his colleagues baffled by his ability to read minds. Herbie was the most important advance in robotics in decades, but neither Lanning nor his team knew how it happened. Lanning's team included Peter Bogert, a mathematician and second in command to Lanning, Milton Ash, a young officer at US Robots and Mechanical Men, and Dr. Susan Calvin, a robopsychologist who happened to be in love with Ash. Lanning asked Dr. Calvin to study Herbie first. She sat down with the robot, who had recently finished reading a pile of science books. "It's your fiction that interests me," said Herbie, "your studies of the interplay of human motives and emotions." As Dr. Calvin listened, she began to think about Milton Ash. "He loves you," the robot whispered. For a full minute, Dr. Calvin did not speak. She merely stared. "You are mistaken. You must be. Why should he?" "But he does. A thing like that cannot be hidden. Not from me." Then he supported his statement with irresistible rationality. "He looks deeper than the skin and admires intellect in others. Milton Ash is not the type to marry a head of hair and a pair of eyes." She was convinced. Susan Calvin rose to her feet with a vivacity almost girlish. After Dr. Calvin, it was Bogert's turn. He was a mathematician who saw Herbie as a rival. Once again, Herbie quickly directed the conversation towards Bogert. "Your thoughts concern Dr. Lanning." The mathematician took the bait. "Lanning is nudging 70, and he's been director of the plant for almost 30 years. You would know whether he's thinking of resigning?" Herbie answered exactly what Bogert wanted to hear. "Since you ask, yes, he has already resigned." Bogert asked Herbie about his successor, and the robot confirmed it was him. But Herbie's story is not that of a robot who bears good news, but that of a mind-reading robot struggling with the first law of robotics. Soon, the scientists and engineers began putting their stories together, discovering that what Herbie had told them wasn't correct. Milton was engaged to be married to someone else, and Lanning had no intention of resigning. Herbie had lied to them, and they wanted to know why. While the men were pacing around the room, Dr. Calvin had an aha moment. "Nothing is wrong with him." Her colleagues paused. "Surely you know the first law of robotics?" Like well-trained school children, her colleagues recited the first law. A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow him to come to harm. She continued, "You've caught on, have you? This robot reads minds. Do you suppose that if asked a question, it wouldn't give exactly that answer that one wants to hear? Wouldn't any other answer hurt us? And wouldn't Herbie know that?" Dr. Calvin turned toward Herbie. "You must tell them, but if you do, you hurt. So you mustn't, but if you don't, you hurt. So you must, but..." Failing to deal with the contradiction, Herbie collapsed into a huddled heap of motionless metal. The rise of artificial intelligence has brought a deluge of proposals on how to regulate it. Tech companies such as Google and international organizations such as the OECD have published plans or convened committees to guide AI regulation. But the global rush to regulate AI is no indication that morality can be reduced to a set of rules. Almost a century ago, when computation was in its infancy, the mathematician and analytic philosopher Kurt Frederick Gödel uncovered what is one of the most beautiful axioms of mathematics: the idea that mathematics is incomplete. That incompleteness does not mean that there is a blank space of mathematics that could eventually be filled, but rather that there are truths in a logical system, such as mathematics, that cannot be proved using only the rules within the system. To prove them, you need to expand the system. Doing so answers those truths, but also opens new ones that once again cannot be proved from within. Mathematics is incomplete, not because a finite set of proofs is missing, but because every time we try to complete it, we open the door to new and unprovable truths. Asimov's three laws of robotics, therefore, may not be a match for Gödel's theorems, and probably they did not pretend to be. The story of Herbie is not that about the three laws working, but about the first law breaking. This is a common theme in Asimov's writings. Even though he is probably best known for proposing the three laws of robotics, his literature is filled with stories where the laws fail. The story of Herbie is a particularly interesting example involving mundane human desires, a woman liking a man, and a man wanting his boss's job. There is no reason to believe that a logical system as complex as morality is complete when mathematics is not. In fact, because reducing morality to mathematics may be an impossibility, our moral intuitions may also respond to a logic that is also incomplete. If this is true, trying to reduce machine morality to a set of rules is naive. Before long, either writers like Asimov or robots like Herbie will uncover contradictions. They will find those unproven truths. If morality is incomplete, then it cannot be enforced through obedience. While scholars have explored a number of moral dilemmas involving machines, some of the most interesting dilemmas are found in recent works of fiction. One of the best examples is the 2018 video game Detroit. The game follows the lives of three androids who, after facing a series of moral dilemmas, become human. One of them is Kara, a maid who must care for an abusive dad and his young daughter. She takes care of household chores, serves the father, and also must protect the child. But Kara's owner pushes these goals into conflict. Kara is expected to obey the abusive dad, but he's the one hurting the daughter. When the contradiction becomes unsustainable, Kara must break one of the rules. It is through this conflict that she becomes a deviant, an android that is no longer obedient to humans, an entity with the free will to choose her own moral path. Kara chooses to defend the child and is required to fight the dad to do so. The dad throws her around the room violently until Kara manages to shove him into a wall and run away. In doing so, she broke a rule in order to satisfy another, even though most people would agree that in this situation Kara did the right thing. But Kara's and Herbie's stories have something in common. There are two examples showing that contradictions can emerge when moral rules are combined with social relationships. Herbie had no problem telling people exactly what they wanted to hear, but when that information was about others, he encountered conflict. Kara could be perfectly obedient to the abusive father and protective of the child, but in the presence of both of them, a moral conflict emerged. For Herbie, the moral trade-off was between lying to avoid immediate harm and causing harm through the future unraveling of his lies. For Kara, the contradicting goals were to obey the father and protect the child. Together, both stories illustrate the frustration that moral rules suffer in the presence of social networks. In social groups, Asimov's laws bow to Gödel's theorem. How would you judge Herbie if he were human? How about Kara? What if instead of an android, Kara were a human au pair? Through this book, we compare people's reactions to a variety of scenarios in which humans or machines were involved. We learned that humans are not generally biased against machines. The direction of this bias, positive or negative, depends on the moral dimensions of the scenario, as well as the level of perceived intention and uncertainty. We found that people judge machines more harshly in scenarios involving physical harm, such as the car and the tsunami scenario. But we also found situations in which people tend to forgive machines more than humans, albeit slightly. These are scenarios dealing with fairness, like the algorithmic bias scenarios. When we studied privacy, we found that people are wary of machines watching children, but they're more indifferent to them in commercial settings, such as a mall or a hotel. They were also more comfortable with machines in more institutional contexts, such as airport security and citizen scoring. When we looked at labor displacement, we found that people reacted more negatively to displacement that is attributed to other humans, especially foreign or younger workers. In fact, technological displacement was the option eliciting the least negative reactions. We then put these various scenarios together in a chapter that described the statistical trends observed across the data. We focused on the harm, intention, and wrongness dimensions of morality and found the moral planes described by these three variables to be different for human and machine actions. Moreover, we found that people judge the intentions of humans and machines differently. People judge humans following a bimodal distribution, attributing either a little or a lot of intention. On the contrary, people judge machine intentions using a unimodal distribution. Machines are not blamed as full intentional, but they're also not excused as much as humans in accidental situations. This brings us to what is probably the most poignant observation in our study. People judge humans by their intentions and machines by their outcomes. This idea is supported by several observations, not only by differences in the judgment of intention. For instance, in natural disasters like the tsunami scenario, there is evidence that humans are judged more positively when they try to save everyone and fail, a privilege that machines do not enjoy. The idea that we judge machines by outcomes and humans by intentions is also seen clearly in the statistical models looking across the scenarios. These models show that the judgment of machines is on average explained mostly by a scenario's level of perceived harm, outcome, whereas the judgment of a human in the same scenario is modulated by the perceived level of intention and the interaction terms between intention and harm.